11:59. I've just started the recording. So again, the test will open tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and it will remain open until Monday night at 11:59. So I want to give you some additional information about how best to approach the test and what the contents will be, what the structure is. And so we'll cover that. Also, a few tips about writing the paper that's due. So these are two major assignments that are due by Friday night, in addition to the work on Daisy Miller, which has been available for the last couple of weeks. So I have not graded those particular assignments yet, simply because not many students have submitted them. Your work for To Build a Fire has been graded. I'm sorry that it took me a little bit longer than normal to get those grades back to you, because unfortunately a lot of us ran into login problems with Blackboard last weekend, and that put me behind. So those are supposed to be cleared up now. I did, if you missed any of the questions for To Build a Fire, by the way, I did attach a copy of sample student responses from the past that kind of explain what a fuller, better, more accurate maybe answer would be for some of the questions. And I tried to identify what you missed and why. So let's begin first with talking about the test. This is the document that is in the test folder currently. You have access to it. And but just a couple of other comments. Of course, these are the 4 works that we've covered from Unit 1 so far. And these are the literary concepts covered. Now, you will need to have good working definitions, because there's a matching section of the test that asks you to sort of match the word, not sort of, to match the word to its definition. Also, there's several places throughout the test where I ask questions about, for example, an illusion. Is this an example of a mythological illusion, a classical illusion, that kind of thing, as well as, there's a question about irony, probably more than one, that as they are applied to various works. So you not only need to understand what the concepts mean, and my recommendation would be just to jot down a list of definitions for these different terms. Most of them have been found on PowerPoints scattered throughout the lessons. But so you will need to know both the definitions and also what they mean enough to be able to apply it if I ask you a question about a particular work. You do have 90 minutes to complete the test. It is timed, and I understand that a lot of students feel very uncomfortable with the fact that there's a ticking time clock. But the reality is, what I've found is, if given students enough time to look up, some students, not all of course, but a few will look up answers online and that kind of thing. And while it's fine with me for you to use your textbooks, it's fine with me if you use any notes that you've taken. It's fine with me if you use any handouts or PowerPoints that I've provided. That's sort of my way of compensating for the fact that we're not meeting face to face. So there are a lot of things that unfortunately you cannot recreate in an online course that happens in a face-to-face course. For example, it's easier to have your questions answered. There's usually a lot more discussion, where a lot more comes out of the discussion. So I try and compensate when it comes to testing by allowing you extra time, because actually students in a face-to-face class take this exact same test, but they have less time to take it in. All right, so I give you a bit more time to take it, and I also allow you to use your books and notes and so forth. But please understand, you don't have time to look up answers, every answer. You've got to study in advance to be prepared for the test. Otherwise, you will not do well. I mean, the biggest problem I find for most students is not that they don't understand the material or that the test is so hard. It's that they haven't adequately prepared, so they're relying on looking up information, and they run out of time. Okay, so do study in advance. Do have your information available and ready for you. Now, please understand, I do not reset tests. I don't go back, and so if you have it, make sure you're working at a reliable computer. Make sure that everything's up to date. So because, I unfortunately, again, have found instances of students cheating by telling me that they've, something happened, they got kicked out of their test, when in fact they printed the test and then went back if I gave them another chance and had already had a chance to look up answers. I'm sorry that I know this, but I do, because and I won't explain how, but I know that this is what happened. And also, if you don't turn the test in within that period of time by Monday night, unless there's a verifiable emergency, and by verifiable I mean that you can provide documentation, you're unfortunately unable to take them. Okay, so that's all the bad news. Let's get that out of the way from the beginning. All right. Now here's the structure of the test. It's overall 100 points, but you do have a series of true/false questions and multiple choice questions. They are 1 point each. All right. And these are more just, kind of knowledge comprehension based questions, although the multiple choice can be a little bit trickier simply because there might be more than one answer that sounds correct, but there's always a best answer if you understand the material. My advice to students is to not get stuck answering 1 point questions. If I were taking this test, I'd do one of two things. I would either start at the end first with the essay question and then work backwards. Or I would begin with the true/false, which is the very beginning, and I would answer everything I know, feel confident about, maybe guess at the ones I don't, but then plan to come back, because you can move backward and forward in the test. So you do have that option. Please never submit it until you're finished with it. But once you sit down, you've got 90 minutes. You can't leave and come back. All right, so you've got to take it within that time frame. Now, some students prefer, though, to save the bigger weighted questions, the heavier weighted questions, to the end, because a lot of times those smaller, more detailed, picky questions actually give them some ideas about what to write about when we start broadening out, and it's more of an evaluative question that's dealing more with kind of themes and concepts and that kind of thing. All right. There are a series of short answer questions, and the point totals vary for those. Everything from 2 points to, I think there might be one that's 8 points. Let the point values indicate how much time and space you need to devote to answering the question. So, for example, if it's an 8 point question, it means you're going to need more detail, and you're probably not going to get a full 8 points if you write one sentence. All right. A 2 point question is just asking for a very direct, quick answer. So I hope that makes sense. All right. Then I have a series of passages that I pull. There's significant lines from each of the 4 short stories, and you pick 4 out of those 8. All right. And what you do is you identify who's doing the talking. Please don't say the author. All right. The speaker is not the author. All right. It's usually a character or the narrator. All right. If there's no character actually talking in the story, then it's the narrator, but it's never, Mark Twain, for example, because that's what authors of fiction do. They create characters. They create voices. Then you identify the work, and then explain why that particular line or set of lines is important to what happens in the story. How is it connected to the overall theme? How is it connected to the plot, the events that take place? Now, here's a note about, and by the way, what I need for you to do at some point during this, for those of you participating, and I apologize, we're going to have, at the end of, whenever I introduce a paper and at the end of every unit, we will have a review session and a session where I go over kind of what's expected on the paper and that kind of thing. And the fact that but I never can find a time that's convenient for a lot of students, so I just have to pick a time that's convenient for me. But what I do is I record the information, and then students can go back and watch it. But in order to ensure that they go back and watch it, if you don't participate during this session, you automatically get 20 points for just a participation grade, as long as at some point during this process, you either answer a question I ask or ask me a question by typing. And you do that, if you don't have microphone or you don't want to use your microphone, you just type the answer in the chat bubble. If you look down at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, there's a little bubble there. If you select it, it opens up a chat room, and you can just type your response or your question there. So I need to guarantee that you're actually participating, not just logged on and then someplace else. At some point during this session, I need for you to participate twice. And by doing so, you will have earned your 20 points, and you do not need to answer the questions that the other students are going to have to answer who were unable to attend the session. So once those students watch this video, then they go back and answer the questions from the video. Okay? So does that make sense? You can earn your first, participation by answering yes right now. Great, thank you, Laura Beth. Okay, and just at some other time during this session, if you and please, if you're on, there's at least one other student. If you're participating, you need to answer now or at some point twice during the session to receive your credit. Okay, that's automatic 20 points. You don't have to take the quiz, but if you don't do that, you will need to take the quiz. Okay, I hope that's clear. It's just my way of making sure that students, because the information is important, it's my way of ensuring that they will go back and actually watch the video. All right, please do not answer all 8 of the questions. I have students who are really they're over prepared and they want to show that they know the information, but when I'm grading, I don't have time to read all 8. So I will just read the first 4, quite frankly, if you do that. So please just pick out the 4 that you feel most comfortable with and identify the speaker, the work, and the significance. And then finally, the most heavily weighted question, notice it's about 1/3 of the grade on the test, is the essay response. And this is usually, you will have an option. There are 3 very general questions, and you will have an option to write about normally you pick the topic that you want to write about, you pick the works you want to write about. They're much broader, they're essay typed questions. Now, in an essay response on a test like this, you do not need an introduction, you do not need a conclusion, you just need a few good paragraphs that are as detailed as possible. They need to be well developed for 30 points, obviously, but they're as detailed as possible. You can use your books, certainly you can quote directly from the text. And I leave a note, I write a note here because this is a very important note. Make sure you budget your time, because remember that the second half of the test is more heavily weighted than the first half. If you spend a lot of time on this, you will not have time for this. Okay, that's the reason, again, it's important to not just look up questions. Okay. Now, if you do go online to find answers, if you actually try and look up answers on the internet, you will receive a 0 on the test. You will fail it. And that's always obvious. It's unfortunate, but it's always obvious when students do that. So please, please, please realize that that is cheating. I allow you all these other resources that I've provided. Please do not do this. Okay. Let's see, again, look over the way that I recommend that you study is not necessarily read everything again, and we're going to do a quick review when we finish talking about the paper in a second, the essay. But I recommend you look back through like the discussion posts, yours and what other people post, especially the Daisy Miller discussion boards, because everybody had different questions. And so they're supposed to provide answers for. And so you need to kind of read the questions and see what other people responded to help you adequately prepare for Daisy Miller. Also look back at the quizzes, look at if you missed anything, look back at the PowerPoints and so forth. Finally, this is really important. Always read the instructions carefully. I have students who jump right in and without reading instructions, and that's often where they get off track. Again, don't get stuck looking up one-point questions. And then, of course, I don't reset tests. All right, does anyone have any questions about the test, its structure, or how to prepare for it? All right, then let's go on to the essay. A character study is essentially taking a character, examining a character closely in a written piece, and to show how the author brought that character to life. And I gave you a handout that talked about indirect characterization. Direct characterization is where an author tells you specifically what to think about a character. All right, she was beautiful, she was lively, everybody loved her. That's direct characterization. Indirect characterization is more subtle, okay, and in some ways even more effective, because it helps a reader infer what a character is like based on how the character acts, how other characters respond to them, if we're inside the character's head, what he or she thinks, how he or she talks, how he or she dresses, his or her appearance. And those are ways of making a character come to life. For example, one of the things we know about Daisy is, in Daisy Miller, is that she has the latest fashions. So even though Daisy doesn't know really how to fit into this European society, what she does know is what she's supposed to look like, right? She's got enough money to wear the latest clothing. And we know that she's attractive, and we're told that she's wearing the latest clothing, but it does not necessarily mean that she knows what she's doing when it comes to fitting in this particular culture. Okay. We certainly have Winterbourne. As a matter of fact, Winterbourne, we totally understand Daisy and every other character in this story through Winterbourne's eyes, largely. But Winterbourne, we have to infer more about what he's like based on, the things he says, the things he thinks, the way other characters respond to him, the way he acts. There's a lot there to work with. In many ways, the two main characters, Winterbourne and Daisy Miller, maybe have the most material, but in some ways the minor characters were actually easier to write about because there's less, so you can focus more in on detail. For example, Friedrich, we know, Randolph, not Friedrich, Daisy's little brother, we know that he's very spoiled. We know that he's very headstrong. We know that, they're just the way he talks and the way he acts, he's sort of out of control. There's a lot that you can say about his particular character, okay? Now, here's the important part about approaching this assignment. I give you some bulleted ideas here. So here's some things. I say it will cover most of this information. That does not mean that you need a paragraph on each of these. As a matter of fact, in many ways, if you approached it in this way, the paper would be disjointed. And what you want, and the only thing that would hold it together, would be the fact that it's about a particular character. Instead, you need to find a thesis, all right? And the thesis is the main point you want to make about the particular character that you've chosen. And then everything that you choose to include in the paper should be about your thesis. All right. These are just some, to me, this would almost be pre-writing. I would jot down anything that kind of helps me figure out what this person is like. Is the character dynamic? Does he or she grow? Or is he or she static? What role does the character play? What motivates the character? Why does the character act this way if you can figure it out? If you're going to label the character, like for example, Daisy Miller is labeled an American flirt. You may or may not see her that way. Let's see, jot down some notes about how what other people say, how the character dresses, and so forth. And to me, this would form your pre-writing, just trying to collect ideas, figure out, you know, in some depth what this particular character is like. But that doesn't mean you include everything that's in your pre-writing in the paper. Does that make sense? This will help you figure out the main point you want to make about the character. And then you only include this information and the details from the story. Please remember to quote directly, all right? That is the most effective way to write about literature, is to not only make a point, but then reveal how it's true by including evidence from the text, direct quotations, all right? And so again, you don't want to write a bullet point for each of these. The paper needs to hold together. It needs to be cohesive and support one main idea. Also notice that I give a word count. So try and sort of hit this target range. A little bit shorter, say 700 words is okay. A little bit longer, say 1,100 words is okay. A lot shorter or a lot longer is not. All right, you've either overwritten and failed to control your information, or you don't have enough to say about what you've chosen. All right. Also, this is not a research paper. Do not do research for this paper. Do not include what anybody else online or otherwise said. This is totally supposed to be from it's your analysis. And here's an important point. Please don't use, I think this should be in the guidelines, but if it's not, you shouldn't put your opinion in there. I think, I believe, I see. That's a personal response paper. That's not an objective analysis. This paper, now obviously these are your opinions, these are your ideas, but you don't want to write in such a way that you are making it about you. It's not, right? It should be about your character. Let's see if there's anything else on here. I do include at the very end, just for practice, this is the correct bibliographic entry, all right, for this story. So just copy this exactly the way that I've got it. There's it. Please don't do additional research. And the two main areas where students do not do, well, there's three. The three main challenges in this paper, or the three main directions that you should avoid, is again, don't use first person I and talk about your opinion and how you feel and what you thought and that kind of thing. You know, express it in third person objective. Second, the students will sort of summarize what happened, or include plot summary that has nothing to do with the character. So you don't need to talk about what happens in the story unless it has to do with the thesis that you want to make, that you have about your character, okay? But they fail to directly quote. So that's the second big problem. And then the third is to not have a thesis and to just kind of be all over the place and answer write information about each bullet, but it's not really tied together, okay? All right, I'm going to pause there. Does anyone have any, before we do our final review of the 4 stories, does anyone have any questions about this paper? It's due Monday night in the Turnitin Dropbox. I will accept it late, but it's with a 10% per day penalty. So for example, if you don't get it in until Wednesday, I'll still take it, but it'll be 20% off whatever the grade would have been. So if I grade your paper and you make, say, an 83, but you turn it in on Wednesday, it'll end up being a 63 because that's a 20-point penalty. All right. I'll take it on Thursday with a 30-point penalty, but after Thursday, it's too late to submit it. All right. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, just a good question, Diana. Yeah, just literally copy this, copy and paste it, highlight it, and do use Control-C or right-click and copy, and just paste it at the very end of your paper. I don't, because this is not a good question, Laura. Because this is not a composition course. this is a sophomore level course. So the assumption is if you've already had English 1101 or English 1101 and 1102, you're not required to take 1102. That's a selection, an option, but you don't have to. But because you've already had English 1101, there's an assumption that we're not going through a drafting process. So there's an assumption you already know how to do this. Does that make sense? But that's the reason that I said here, if you want to email me a draft to kind of informally look over and make sure you're on the right track, I ask that you do so by today. Because quite frankly, I'm going to be out of the office tomorrow. I'm going to be out of town. So I would be, if students had gotten it to me early enough, I would look at it. Since you've had a couple of weeks to work on this, I would informally look at it and get back to you and just tell you if you're on the right track or not. But this is not a composition course. This is a literature course. Does that make sense? Now, if you absolutely fail it, we'll see. Okay, I'll be happy to take a look, Diana, if you send me what you've got, and I'll just again, it's. I teach the literature, the composition courses as well, both 1101, which is, writing about writing essays, and then 1102, which is writing essays about literature. It's more literature focused. So this course, the assumption is you already know how to do all of this, right? So we're just kind of how to do this, but I'm happy to informally give you feedback. So if you just get it to me. All right, great questions. Anything else? Okay, then we are going to just briefly go over the 4 short stories. I'm going to add a little bit more information that maybe you don't have. And I'm going to try hard not to answer the questions that everybody's already answering about Daisy Miller. But I just want to give you more context, and having read your responses to discussion boards and sort of taken a look at how students have done with questions and that kind of thing, I think I understand if you have a misunderstanding about one of these, what I need to address and the kinds of things that maybe I didn't, that I don't. Then I'll answer any of your questions. First, Luck of Roaring Camp. And by the way, if I provided author information, I can already tell you there will be one question on the test that kind of connects the author to what he, in this case they're all men, have written. So if you want to take a look back at, about their lives, again, it's not going to be a question that's heavily weighted, but there is one there since I have provided information about the authors. So, so you can kind of go ahead and prepare yourself for that particular question. It will not be the essay question, I can tell you that. So it's not going to be heavily weighted. But Bret Harte wrote The Luck of Roaring Camp largely because at this time, a popular novel, it was called a penny novel, and a popular novel, it was kind of a pulp form, meaning that they were mass produced and everybody followed kind of the same format, had these stereotypical characters who went west. So you had the prostitute with the heart of gold, and you had the rugged mining men, and the desperate outlaws, and that kind of thing. And they were all kind of the same. The stories didn't vary a lot, and the characters were kind of two-dimensional. There wasn't a lot of difference. And so part of the reason that Bret Harte wrote The Luck of Roaring Camp is because he wanted to mix it up a little bit. He wanted something different, a bit more complex. Even though this story is funny, it's supposed to be funny. It's even though the character Luck dies and Kentuck die at the end, and death is not something we necessarily find funny. It begins with the death, it ends with the death, right? It begins with the death of Cherokee Sal, and it ends with the death of Luck and Kentuck. But there are parts of it that are it's supposed to be funny. But one of the things that Harte does is he kind of adds life to this story through irony mainly, by doing the unexpected, by presenting the unexpected. So, of course, this is a mining town, and it's interesting that two of the short stories, well, three of them that you read this time have to do with miners, you know. But one of the things that it shows was how important that move west was during this period of time. There were so many people trying to find their fortune, and once they struck gold in the Yukon, and you know, I had that PowerPoint with To Build a Fire about people going to the Yukon and how few people actually struck gold, but a lot of people made their money on miners or people trying to go west, right? So a lot of like retailers, you know, people who established saloons and that kind of thing, they did it. And I think back, you know, you can think back to the notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. Calaveras County was also a mining town, and at one point, and so I mean the town within Calaveras County, and so we have a saloon keeper there. So that's how a lot of people made their money, was trying to supply the men, and it was largely, almost entirely men going west to try and make a fortune, to try and strike it rich. So there's something about the kind of man, and this is a question that you might want to contemplate, because it will show up in the test in a couple of different ways. What kind of person is drawn to that kind of a life? And so one of the things that Hart did that was so different was that his characters, I'm going to jump down this bullet, are not traditional stock characters. They're more complex and dynamic. So for example, you know, one of my favorite bits of humor in this story is that paragraph that's a description of all these different people, and they don't look like you would expect them to look. For example, you've got I think he was a gunfighter that was compared to Raphael's, a painting by Raphael. Well, let me show you what that looks like. If you'll give me just a second here to set this up. If I can get it to work. Right, this is a painting by Raphael. Okay, look how soft, look how beautiful, you know, the faces are, and a lot of Raphael's paintings were biblical in nature. You've got, you know, the little cherubic angels here in the bottom, and so, but you've got this like rugged gunslinger who is described as having the face from a Raphael painting, and so the idea here is that he was very beautiful. But yet he was this kind of guy who was drawn to this life. You have the one gunslinger who essentially was described as having one of his hands, he only had 4 fingers on one hand. One guy was really short. There were just a lot of like descriptions there that were very humorous and unexpected, especially unexpected because that was not something that would have been common at that time as far as the writing about people who were in the mining camps in fiction. Notice that the way that Roaring Camp, the place, is described is that it's somewhat isolated. It's kind of like in a valley, so it's cut off from the rest of the world. And by the way, there is a description that refers to it as a city of refuge. This is a biblical allusion. By city of refuge, I don't know if you're familiar at all with New Testament in the Bible scripture, but cities of refuge were identified as places where people who were being chased or wanted could go and be safe. For whatever, like if they committed a crime, if they could get to a city of refuge, then they could not be hunted down there. And so Roaring Camp was described as a city of refuge. And the idea, of course, was that, you know, it had all these characters with shady pasts who've come together trying to make their fortune. And one of the things, for example, Stumpy, we know Stump, who ended up being kind of the surrogate father figure, although Kentuck, you know, as well kind of stepped in. But Stumpy was kind of voted the father for Luck because he was rumored to have two different families. In other words, he committed bigamy. He'd married two different women and had two different sets, two different families, and that's of course illegal. In all but I think Utah, right? So, so he was trying to escape from the law and so everybody figured, gosh, this guy's a family man, so he would be perfect, right? So that's part of the humor in the story as well. And we already talked about it. The title itself is ironic. The luck of Roaring Camp. Well, luck ends up not surviving, but he has this incredible impact on all of, he totally cleans up the town. Everybody cleans up their act because of this baby. That, of course, is irony. That's probably the main irony, that the idea that this innocence could come in and have these men actually become self-reflective and change their lives because of it, because of his presence. And they were worried about like getting other families in, so he'd have somebody to play with. Kentuck starts cleaning his clothes. They try and make these little, everything kind of lovely for him, plants. It's, the whole thing is really kind of hilarious, his impact. And then of course the irony is that it gets washed out at the end anyway, and that he dies in that almost biblical flood that's going through, that wipes out that town. So is it lucky at all, right? So many things, again, are ironic in the story. It's full of irony. It's the opposite of what you would expect. The list of gifts that they bring him are funny. Some of the things are stolen. Some things he obviously can't use. It's just, and then the fact that Kentuck, this really rugged old character, because the baby it's that human connection, because the baby grabs his finger, that connection was enough to totally change, this rugged old guy's life. So that too is really humorous. Now, the story, as I mentioned, had several allusions to it. There's another biblical allusion. It talked about Cherokee Sal, who is Luck's mother. She's the one-town prostitute, so of course nobody knows who the father was. And it talks about her suffering Eve's curse. And the whole idea, that idea was because of the fall in the Genesis story in the Old Testament of the Bible, the idea that women, if you're familiar with that, women are, because of the fall, Adam and Eve's fall and expulsion from paradise, that women then are, give birth in pain. That's part of the curse. So it talks about that particular biblical allusion. And there are other scholars who have, and critics of the story, who've almost seen, they laugh about Luck being almost like a Christ-like figure, that idea of coming in and making all these changes. Now, of course, all of that's somewhat ironic and tongue-in-cheek. On a classical allusion, you have the reference to Romulus and Remus, all right, which is mythological. I don't know if you're familiar. I've got a real quick. This is a very famous sculpture of Romulus and Remus. This sculpture of the she-wolf, and you have these two twin boys who essentially are kept alive through this she-wolf. And so there's a reference to that particular mythological illusion. It's a classical mythological illusion. But when it talks about using, I think it was the milk of an ass to keep a donkey, basically, to keep Luck alive. And so there's that reference. And the whole idea about Romulus and Remus was that they were twins who had been foretold to destroy their father, and one was going to found a great empire. And of course, that was Romulus. Rome was supposedly named after him, and of course that's all a mythological allusion. Then the literary allusions, there's an allusion to Hamlet, and Hamlet if you've never studied the Shakespearean play Hamlet, Hamlet was considered probably Shakespeare's masterwork, but the character of Hamlet never could make a decision. And it wasn't until the end of the play that he finally decided to avenge his father's death. And by then, the body count, as with most Shakespearean tragedies, the body count was so high that had he acted sooner, fewer people would have died. But anyway, and so there's a character that's described as being like Hamlet. So that's mainly, the story is pretty straightforward. It's not hard to understand as long as you get the humor and the irony, because it's full of it. All right. I realize it's not an easy read necessarily. It's a denser. A lot of these earlier pieces are denser as far as a lot of words, lengthier paragraphs, more complex language. But it's supposed to be humorous. Oh, yeah, To Build a Fire, part of the interesting thing about To Build a Fire and the sadness there, the desperation, I mean, I think a lot of us kind of identify with the man's desperation because we could just imagine what it would be like to be in that particular situation. The Luck of Roaring Camp was supposed to be humorous. I mean, the end is a little bit poignant, yes, because the baby and Kentuck die, but and Kentuck is happy about it, the fact that he's going with Luck all the way to heaven. But the story is there's so much humor in that it's actually supposed to be read not as sort of this heavy piece, but more of a, in some ways, satirizing the types of novels that were, the types of stories that were really popular then. So, but I understand your point, absolutely. You're certainly not the only one who's felt that way about these particular stories. All right, does anybody have any questions about Luck of Roaring Camp? All right, if not, we'll go on to The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. A couple of things to note here. It's almost not a short story because it doesn't really have a plot that goes anywhere. What it is more is what we call a frame narrative. And a frame narrative, forgive my drawing because it's going to be rough, is a story within a story. All right. So what you have is an external narrator, okay, talking about, and that's the man from the East. He's cultured, he's educated, and he's visiting Calaveras County, and he's looking for a character named, he's been told to look up a character named Leonidas Smiley, who is a pastor. Now, some students got confused. Jim Smiley is not Leonidas Smiley. They just have the same last name. And so what happens is the story here within the story told by Simon Wheeler, who's the saloon owner and the big talker, it's almost like a tall tale. If you've ever heard of Paul Bunyan's Tall Tales and some folklore that's kind of larger than life, well, that's what's happening here. You've got this external narrator from the East who runs into this character, Simon Wheeler, and all it takes is the mention of the last name Smiley to get this guy talking and cornering our external narrator, okay? Now, the purpose of the external narrator usually is to somehow or another make a contrast with the guy who's doing most of the talking. So this external narrator, he's not named, but he's sophisticated. He is well-traveled. He's educated. We know that by his language. And then we know that this internal narrator, and this is where the local color comes in with all the dialogue and so forth. This guy is a big talker. He's a teller of tall tales, and he basically traps our external narrator into telling the story, all these little vignettes, these little excerpts about Jim Smiley, who is the big gambler, right? The second thing students often misunderstand is that the story is set in Calaveras County, California, not the South. I think the dialogue is what throws people off because the dialogue sounds very sort of what we call country or Southern. but it's actually California. And the minor, of course, I mean, the speaker Wheeler is Simon Wheeler is not sophisticated. He's not educated. In contrast, and he's just got lots of stories to tell. Maybe bored, who knows? But it was settled by minors, and Calaveras County is still there, and they still have a jumping frog contest every year. If you look on YouTube, you can see where every year they film the jumping frog contest. I doubt during the pandemic they had it, but it's still held. There are two historical allusions. So remember, there are four types of literary allusions. And allusions are references that are not explained. The author just expects readers to understand what he or she is talking about by mentioning them. And so we've got two real Americans, Andrew Jackson, who was, I think, the 15th president, and Daniel Webster, who was a statesman and a very famous orator. He was well known for being able to basically argue anything. I think he attempted to run for president at one point, or at least higher office. I think he was Secretary of State at one point. But he could talk. I mean, he just had the skills of a debater. And as a matter of fact, you may have heard of the short story, the Daniel and called The Devil and Daniel Webster. And the short story basically was about a man who lost his soul at a crossroads to the devil. And so when the devil came to collect, the man got Daniel Webster to defend him. And actually Daniel Webster put forth such great arguments that the man got his soul back. So, so anyway, the fact that we had two of the animals who are participating in, I mean, this is supposed to be humorous, of course, naming them after these two men, and it's supposed to say something about the animals and the character of Jim Smiley. And then, of course, there's so much local color, especially in the characterization. Because, again, the thing about a frame narrative, and in this case, this particular story, it's less about what happens and more about the characters themselves. Okay. All right, do you have any questions about this short story? All right, to build a fire, we'll go on to this. To build a fire, a couple of things I wanted to mention. First of all, if students tended to miss any question of the four that I gave you about the short story, because I think everybody understands what happens, and a lot of you found the movie helpful. It's about the question instinct versus judgment, because if you look at the story itself, it intentionally mentions that the man is prone to judgment, but he's disconnected from his instinct, where the dog totally reacts out of instinct and therefore survives. And the man does not use instinct, right? He's not connected. So there's a question, the first question had to do with imagination and his failure to kind of see beyond just what was, he had this plan, he didn't think beyond it, he does not examine, he's not self-critical, he's not self-reflective. He's obviously foolish by not taking the old-timers' advice. And but it also shows that the man is disconnected from his instinct, his survival instincts, because the dog knew immediately it was too cold to be out there, right? But the man, and the dog is relying on his instinct at the very end to make it all the way to where the man was going, so because he knew there'd be men and there'd be food and there'd be fire there. So the man is divorced from his survival instinct, and so that's part of but the story makes it very clear. If you go back and actually look at passages, the first 2 pages, it talks a lot about the man making judgments using his brain. Kind of in his brain, it's never been in this situation before. I mean, that's the problem. It's not that the man's unintelligent. It's just he's exposed himself to an environment he's never been a part of before. Now, this is called a Freytag's model, and it has to do with, exposition is the introduction where it sets everything up. And then complications and rising action, this is where, of course, things begin to happen. The fire goes out, the man gets wet. Crisis is kind of like the next of the most serious thing that happens. So when essentially the snow falls on his fire, and then the climax is when everything changes. When the man is out of matches, that's the climax of the story. There's no other way to make a fire. He does panic. He does think he can get warm with the dog, but he can't catch the dog. You know, so this is where, again, the climax of the story is when everything takes a turn. And then falling action is when the man begins to, you know, there's not a lot after that, but he begins to be aware that, you know, hypothermia is setting in. He realizes he has an epiphany. An epiphany is a sudden recognition or understanding that the old man was right. You know, he thinks back, because until then he's got so much pride. You know, he thinks he's going to make it. He thinks he knows better than what he's been told by someone who's more has more experience. And then denouement is a French word that simply means the ending, the closing. And of course we know the man is the dog. The denouement in this story is the man being left behind as the hypothermia sets in, and the dog moving on to the camp. All right. So this is all pretty straightforward. That would be the only thing I would say about, you know, look back at the questions that you answered. If you missed anything, I usually wrote you a note, and I also provided some information as to the best answers. Any questions about this story before we move on to Daisy Miller? And we'll finish up. Sorry, this is taking a little bit longer than I thought, I bet. Okay, Daisy Miller. Okay, great. All right, thank you. Daisy Miller, one of the key things to understand here is that both Winterbourne, Mrs. Costello, and Mrs. Walker are all Americans, all right? But they're Americans who have lived in Europe for so long that they've become what's called Europeanized, all right? They're expatriate Americans. That means they've lived abroad for a very long time in Europe, and so they've adopted the customs and the ways and the dress and the expectations that Europeans have. Now, the term nouveau riche is a French term that means newly rich, okay? And Daisy Miller's family is newly rich. This was a time, and remember that the Unit 1 begins post-Civil War and continues through roughly 1914-ish, and especially during the early 1900s, with the Industrial Revolution, you know, with the rise of money that's being made through factories, through the automobile, through steel making, a lot of people got really rich. Okay, they were called, as a matter of fact, I don't know if you've studied this in history class, but they were called robber barons. You can look up the term later if you're interested. But it's how people like the Carnegies and the Mellons and the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, these people all made a lot of money during this period of time. And Daisy Miller's father was not a robber baron, but he was a banker. And he was a banker at a time that it was a good time to be a banker. And so he became wealthy as well. So the thing is that Daisy Miller's family doesn't have a background to know how to, they were not born to high society. They just kind of made it there, right? Because they suddenly had a lot of money. And so the Millers do not really know how to handle themselves. They know what it's like in Buffalo, New York, right, which is where they're from, and they're very familiar with the culture there, but they certainly are not familiar with how to act abroad, which is what people in America who had money for a long time perhaps would know. They would be more well-traveled, they would be more connected, and they would know what you should do and shouldn't do. So the Millers are totally out of place, right? And this study, and again, this is psychological realism. Why do people behave the way that they do? All right, that's what James was exploring. Henry James was exploring. His brother is very famous. His brother is William James, who was a very famous psychiatrist. when psychiatry was just taking off. So both of these men, James himself was much like Winterbourne. He liked to study people. He would stay back and observe and jot down things in notebooks. As a matter of fact, the story Daisy Miller actually came from a story that he heard about when he was traveling abroad. And of what actually happened to an American girl in Rome. And so he took it and he kind of played around with it. A lot of it's fiction, of course, but in many ways, Winterbourne is like, represents the author, Henry James, who is thinking to himself, why did she act this way? What's she like? Why is she this way? And so so initially, Winterbourne responds to Daisy. He's never seen anybody like her before because, of course, and so he's trying to figure her out. He's fascinated. She's beautiful. You know, and in many ways, Winterbourne, I'm going to try not to answer the questions, but Winterbourne's sort of hypocritical because the very things he gets so mad about Giovanelli doing later are the very things that he's done with Daisy. Been alone with her without a chaperone, which would have been unheard of at the time. So one of the questions is, because this is, since we're dealing with psychological realism, most everything we know about Daisy we know through Winterbourne. How reliable is he? Because he doesn't always act consistently, right? So it forces the reader, instead of being able to rely entirely on him, to kind of figure out for themselves how they feel about Miller and Winterbourne and what's happening in these cultures. And in many ways, this you know, Mrs. Costello, his aunt, who is so, I mean, she's just supposedly shocked by the behavior of these people, but she's so disconnected from society. Notice she barely leaves her room. She knows how people are supposed to act. She just doesn't get out there and do it. Characterization we've already talked about a little bit. You know, Daisy, think about her name and notice that she changed her name. That's not her real name. Her real name is Annie, right? And she changed her name from Annie to Daisy. Now, what do you know about the flower of daisy? If you think about symbolically, daisies they're very common, right? So they grow, they're kind of wild. The fresh is a great word. Fresh is perfect. Fresh is a daisy. Is an expression that we use. They're lovely, especially Gerber daisies are really, kind of pretty, but they can be wild. They grow wild, especially the little white ones, and they can be somewhat common. They're not as sophisticated, for example, as roses or other flowers that take a lot more effort and a lot more work. The most common form, they're white. So there's a purity and an innocence, and there's a question that has to do with purity and innocence in the story. And the question is, how innocent is Daisy? And one of the things you need to realize is that the implication is that Daisy's behaving inappropriately. It does not mean what it would mean in 21st century. It doesn't mean that she's sleeping with men. All right. It simply means she may be, but it means that her behavior is scandalous because young ladies at that time did not go off alone with men. And so the implication there is that she is behaving inappropriately, and maybe she's gone that far, but it doesn't even matter because then you would not be seen without a chaperone with you, okay? So that's part of the scandal of Daisy. But it's up to us as readers to figure out what we really think of her. How annoying do we really find her? Is she a tragic figure? Did she bring about her own death was another question. And notice, I'm going to point this out, there's a question about illness, and a lot of students miss this. A lot of students get the malaria, the idea of, Daisy got sick because she was at the Coliseum at night, so there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of moisture and so mosquitoes which carry malaria. Her mother has dyspepsia, and dyspepsia is a disease, an illness of the stomach. It's usually, especially for people who are really highly nervous, And so one of the things we know about Daisy's mother is that she's in over her head, both with her children and in that culture. She knows she doesn't know what she's doing, right? And then, of course, we have Mrs. Costello, who has headaches and claims she can't go places or meet people because of these headaches. Well, the thing about headaches, right, are, a pain in the head, which has to do with thinking. So you can think maybe in terms, if we're going to start looking at these diseases symbolically and what they might mean, the whole idea that Mrs. Costello is critical, that a lot of her problems are in her head, if that makes sense. All right, so I'm going to pause there. Does anybody have any questions about Daisy Miller? Hopefully that gives you a frame. The Millers made enough money that they could go travel. The dad stays behind. We certainly know that Randolph, her brother, is out of control, thinks America is the best. In many ways, Randolph actually represents America at that stage in its growth, that it really, very wealthy, very arrogant in some respects. My way or the highway, we're the best, all that kind of idea, and loud, aggressive, does what he wants to, kind of spoiled would be some of the idea. And so certainly America at that point in its development was often seen that way, and still is, quite frankly, by a lot of Europeans. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because we've gone a little bit long. Do you have any questions for me about anything we've covered? All righty. Winterbourne's age. One of the things we know is he's not married. Daisy's a lot younger than he is, but that's not necessarily totally scandalous. How old was he? I want to say he was 26 or something like that. And also, one of the things to notice about Winterbourne is that the story ends exactly the way that it began. We come full circle, and Winterbourne goes back to Geneva, and there's still rumors again with him misbehaving with some married woman. So Winterbourne, which kind of shows how he's not entirely reliable, and Daisy's very young, and Daisy's young. So the whole idea of being fresh and is part of it, absolutely. And that's part of the reason he feels very protective towards her. But it does matter that he is perhaps not as, while he's busy examining her, he should have lived long enough to understand himself a little bit better, and he hasn't. So I think that may be where the age part, and he's probably a little bit too old for her. By the way, one other note about Giovanelli, who was her Italian love interest. One of the things about Giovanelli, even though he was a lawyer, notice that being a professional like a doctor or a lawyer didn't immediately kind of put you in that same level of society as the Millers were. For Mrs. Walker and Winterbourne were friends, but I don't think there's no, and she looks out for him, but there's no indication that there's any kind of anything other than just affection, sort of normal affection. That's a good question. The thing about back to Winterbourne and well, now I've lost my train of thought. Sorry, it's been a long day. Anyway, oh, that's okay. No, I'm glad you asked the question when you had it. Not a problem at all. Yeah, I mean, the thing about Winterbourne is he really should have known. He should have kind of known better, or at least been not been quite as caught up in his response and attempting to categorize her. And Giovanelli is what I was saying. Giovanelli was kind of a social climber. So the idea was, yeah, he may have been trying to maybe he was trying to seduce Daisy, but he also, that was how he got access to places like Mrs. Walker's, because he would not naturally have been invited. Being professional was just a kind of it was part of a trade of being a lawyer. It wasn't like in our culture they make a lot of money, right? Or many lawyers do, not all of them, but that doesn't mean that he was considered of a higher social status. So Daisy helped him get places he wouldn't have gotten otherwise, if that makes sense. But you notice he says at the end he realizes that she never would have married him, so she kind of knew better. All right, any other questions? All right, ladies, if not, I wish you a good afternoon. You definitely both got full credit for participation, so you don't need to answer the quiz questions, not necessary. I will enter